on your sheet. So it starts out with the journey to Galilee. So Jesus is so all of chapter 3, basically starting with the interaction with Nicodemus, right? That whole chapter is set in Jerusalem, although there is kind of, as we talked about, then you switch to John the Baptist, and then there's a discussion between John the Baptist and some Pharisees. So it's kind of like the camera angle in a sense. Meanwhile, John the Baptist is having a debate with the Pharisees, but now it's kind of John has to move Jesus geographically and theologically out of Jerusalem. So it picks up when Jesus, or the Lord, there are different manuscripts that have different traditions around the word right there. But when the Lord learned that the Pharisees had heard Jesus is making and baptizing more disciples than John, which we just saw in the last section. So that's kind of that continues the story, the narrative story kind of picks up on that. Although it was not Jesus himself, but his disciples who baptized. Now, mouth dropping, right, jaw dropping, it just said, let me read to you, right, in verse 20, chapter 3, verse 22, which we covered last week. After this, Jesus and his disciples went into the Judean countryside, and he spent some time with them and baptized. I mean, just a little while ago it said Jesus baptized, and then it says, well, Jesus didn't baptize, actually his disciples. In verse 22 in chapter 3 is absolutely clear. There's no ambiguity about the subject of that. I mean, Jesus let it. So, what gives here? So clearly John, the writer of the story, this isn't a typo, right? I mean, this is like, oh, did I mention? Oh, shoot, I didn't catch that. It's already to the printer. So clearly that's not what's happening. So John is doing something. Whenever you see something like this in John, you have to understand he's doing something. He's up to something. And so this is John in his narrative making a progression, in a sense, showing how the action, and John is speaking not just as a historical document, but he's writing a gospel for the church. And by specifically saying that the disciples were baptized. And by the way, we don't have another notice like that. We don't have in Matthew, Mark, or Luke a notice specifically saying the disciples baptized. We see John the Baptist baptizing, but we don't, and by the way, we never see in the other Gospels, we never see Jesus baptizing. And it's one of the big two sacraments, right? I mean, in the dominical sacraments, baptism and Eucharist. We just don't see Jesus do it in the other three. John is our only testimony to Jesus actually baptizing himself. And so the idea is that the disciples are, in a sense, taking over the mission and the ministry. And this is John's way of speaking to his church, since to show them that Jesus started baptizing, but the church is commissioned to continue that work. And it says Jesus is still with them, right? At this point in chapter 4, Jesus is still with them. And he's, in a sense, overseeing the baptism conducted by the disciples. So it's theologically, and in a narrative theological sense, what John is saying here is that Jesus is still present when the disciples, aka the church, baptizes. That the church, the disciples who continue the Jesus movement, they are baptizing in the name of and in the presence of Jesus himself. This isn't, in a sense, a new, like a third epoch where you have John the Baptist, Jesus, then the disciples. The disciples are an organic growth from the ministry of Jesus. That's what John is really trying to do here, is to say that Jesus didn't have to do everything, right? The disciples could take over. And we're going to see this, and you see this dynamic in the other Gospels and in John, in the feeding of the multitudes, right? That Jesus blesses and breaks. In the Synoptic Gospels, Jesus blesses and breaks, and then the disciples hand it out. In John's Gospel, in chapter 6, we won't cover that in class because we read it in church. But in John's Gospel, Jesus himself seems to be, John is suggesting, Jesus himself is going around with everything, right? And again, that's a theological point that John is making, right? But so, in a sense, the Synoptics have the disciples carrying forward the Eucharistic symbol in the feeding of the multitudes. Here, John has the disciples carrying forward the baptismal symbol, the sacrament of baptism, into the future. So and again, if you're a conservative Protestant inerrantist, like the scriptures are inerrant in the original autographs, you either have to say this wasn't an original, this wasn't an original document, or the Bible isn't true. You just get yourself a knot. See, there's no way out of this. 3:22 says Jesus baptized. 4:3 says he did it. And you have to enter into John's gospel in that deeper theological narrative reading in order to make sense of what John is doing. Otherwise, you think that John's, or another solution, which is actually popular in the academy. This is one way to do it. Either John was sloppy, that's one way to do it, or someone other than John came in and added some text, right? So, given how deeply theological and symbolic John is, to me, it seems much more credible to say John is doing something theological here, just like he does with his geography, period, right? That John doesn't do geography in the sense of wanting you to know exactly where stuff happened. For John, that isn't important. He does theology with place names, right? So that's how John, he doesn't do geography, he does theology with place names. So he's doing the same thing here. So he's also, Jesus is making and baptizing more disciples. And John, this theme of baptism is going to carry a theme of water right into chapter 4, where we have Jesus meeting a Samaritan woman where? At a well. See, again, this is John just doing like these little things. He didn't have to start chapter 4 this way, right? He could have just started, Jesus went to Samaria. But John specifically notes about the baptism in order to thematically link the Samaritan woman at the well, John, chapter 3, Nicodemus being born from above, all the way back to chapter 2 with the wedding, which we'll get into the wedding in chapter 2, and then forward in chapter 5. We'll get there next week, I guess. In chapter 5, you'll have Jesus meeting the invalid at the pool of Siloam. So, again, you have in this early part of John, he's really dwelling in water imagery. And then, guess what happens? Then in chapter 6, the famous feeding of the multitude, and then, I am the bread of life, unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood. So, what does John do? He moves from earlier in his narrative, he goes from baptismal water imagery, and then shifts to Eucharistic imagery in chapter 6 and then forward. That's you can see. So he's he's trying to make all these theological points in the very way that he structures his narrative. Okay, so that's just as you enter into John, just even the passages we don't cover, I'm trying to equip you to be a faithful reader of John's gospel in my absence. Kind of like what the narrative says Jesus is doing, right? Like when, so when I'm not here, you all read John faithfully, just like Jesus says, when I'm not here, you all keep baptizing, right? So that's what he's up to. So then in verse 4, this section is verse 4, but he, meaning Jesus, had to go through Samaria. So he's going back to Galilee. So again, Jerusalem in John's gospel has the opposite symbolic meaning as Jerusalem does in the Synoptic Gospels. That is, the Synoptic Gospels, Jerusalem is where all the action happens. That's the kind of home place. Jerusalem means the kingdom of God. In John's Gospel, Jerusalem is the site of opposition, unbelief, condemnation. That's true. That's what Jerusalem symbolizes. Galilee, right? In the Synoptic Gospels, Jesus goes from Galilee to Jerusalem and he doesn't go back, right? It's a one-way trip to Jerusalem. In John, he's going back and forth several times. And so Galilee then is the symbol of the world that is open to the good news, that is the mission field. So whereas Luke has Acts of the Apostles to show the good news of Jesus and the power of the Holy Spirit going to the nations, to the Gentiles, John builds that into his gospel. He doesn't need a part 2 because he builds that into his gospel through the symbolism of Galilee. Galilee stands for the region of the Gentiles, right? Which, by the way, Matthew also does when he says Galilee, region of the Gentiles, those who have sat in darkness have seen a great light, those in the shadow of death have seen the morning. So the prophetic witness kind of is at the foundation of all this. This isn't just John, but this is John really tapping into the prophetic witness of a church. And so he goes back to Galilee, but he had to go through Samaria. Now, the had to, again, geographically speaking, Jesus did not have to go through Samaria. So if the Samaritans are the enemy for the Jews, and there are lots of Jews in Galilee who have to make at least a yearly pilgrimage at the time of the Passover, if you're in good health, and etc., to Jerusalem. Do you suppose those Jews had a road that detoured around Samaria? Yes, they did. They'd been walking that road for at least 150 years prior to this. So Jesus did not have to go through Samaria on the level of geography, right? But he had to. In the Greek word here is a dia, is D-I-A. It indicates kind of a not a necessity of exigency, but a necessity of purpose. That is, the word communicates, in order to fulfill his mission, Jesus had to go. Not because there was no other way to go back to Galilee. So what John is doing is saying the Samaritans, the enemy, the rejected other, is included in the necessity of Jesus' mission to the world. They are a part of the mission. He had to go because that was what he was there to do. That was part of his glory. It's so important. I mean, and we wouldn't read that on a Sunday, so I'd have to go. It's like, well, we just before, and I do this sometimes in sermons. Well, just before we start this lesson, there's a little bit. But this little like hangnail of a verse, verse 4 is sitting out there, but it's so full of meaning. It explains why the Samaritan woman, right? What's the deal here? Unfortunately, the way that, again, the reason why I'm loving going through the gospel like this is that I can trace these thematic developments, whereas on a Sunday in the middle of Lent, when we read chapter 4, almost in its entirety, it's almost like yet another random incident of Jesus being kind to somebody, right? And there's not even like a healing. There's no miracle, but evidently he's a nice person, and he doesn't reject people, right? But when you get that dia in there, when you get that had to, that must, it's the same word that Jesus uses when he says, the Son of Man must be betrayed into the hands of sinners, suffer, be crucified, and die. It's the same word in the same sense. It's that sort of mustness about going to Samaria. So he's going to go to Galilee, to the land of the Gentiles, to the arena of mission, through Samaria, through the place of the enemy, in a sense. And so he's going to turn enemies into friends. So all the synoptics, the Matthew, Mark, and Luke, especially, and Mark and Matthew especially, depict the coming into Galilee as a withdrawal of Jesus away from opposition on the River Jordan. So in the Synoptic Gospels, whose timeline you're probably more familiar with, basically Jesus gets baptized by John the Baptist, right? And then he goes to Galilee from there. Mark and Matthew both depict going to Galilee in light of John's the Baptist's arrest and execution. Interestingly, in between Jesus' baptism at the Jordan and the beginning of his ministry in all three Gospels, Luke, of course, has the famous first sermon in Nazareth, right, where he goes back to his hometown. All those Synoptic Gospels have an incident which you all hear about on the first Sunday of Lent, which is the temptation. In John's Gospel, there is no temptation. Right? Because, why? So it's like, did John not think the temptation happened? By no means. As St. Paul would say. By no means. Again, the way that John is going to handle that is he's going to spread the temptation out through the whole Gospel. In a sense, the other three, the Synoptics, have a decisive confrontation with Satan at the beginning of Jesus' public ministry, right? Where Satan tempts him to be flashy, to be miraculous, to assert coercive, violent power over others, the authority of the nations, and Jesus rejects all those and then moves on and goes to the cross. John is going to have those sorts of temptations get flung at Jesus along the way. So I'll let you hear those as we go and say, aha. And by the way, you typically don't hear those on a Sunday. You don't hear John's temptations, whereas the other synoptics, you have the temptation of Christ. In John, it's the temptations of the Messiah. Because I think John, in some ways, for John, that's a way to indicate to you, in some ways, a much more realistic understanding of Jesus' ministry. I mean, do you suppose that, like, Satan said, okay, I'm beat, I'm done, or do you suppose Satan kept coming at him all the way through, right? So John is going to say Satan was going after Jesus all along the way, right? And so anyway, so there's no temptation here. That will first appear in John chapter 6. So instead you have Samaria. So you have, I'm going to be jumping because again, it's like my whole thing is here. I don't want to steal my own thunder for the sermon on the Samaritan woman that will come up in Lent. So I'm not gonna bust myself for that. So you skip over the whole Samaritan woman at the well, right? Other than to simply note that the meeting, and I'll probably, this may come up in the sermon, but I'll note it here just because we're tracking John's thematic, the unity of John's gospel across these chapters is, Cana of Galilee's wedding, right? And then you have chapter 4, when in the Bible, in the Old Testament, when a man meets a woman at a well, a wedding is soon in the offing. Right? That's how Jacob meets, Rachel, and Moses meets Zipporah at a well. So basically the meeting at a well in the biblical world is nuptial imagery.
Is what? I'm sorry.
It's nuptial imagery, N-U-P-T-I-A-L. So it's wedding imagery, it's marriage imagery. So again, that's how John is going to be unifying thematically. And so that just, again, this may come out in a sermon on the passage, but just to underline the scandal of Samaria that John goes right into, and there was a Samaritan woman at a well, and Jesus shows up there, and he sends his disciples. He's already sent his disciples. It's kind of like you have to think, there's like in a path, a fork in the path, and like the village is this way, and the well is this way, and he sends his disciples over there because they don't see her in the beginning. They only find her with him afterwards, and they are scandalized. truly, they are shocked and appalled. Like, and it reports that in the gospel. They were saying among themselves, what is she doing here? Like, what is he up to with her? There is this sort of kind of like, Jesus, this is not very becoming. Because of the scene. Because of, you don't spend time alone with women at wells. That was just not something that, men of good repute did. And women of good repute, right? So you just didn't do it. But let alone by yourself. So it's basically, when John starts that story, it's a wedding is about to happen. And so of course the wedding is not a literal wedding, right? It's an espousal of God to a new people. The Samaritans are his brides too, right? And it's, so anyway, I'll save the rest for the sermon. I started going on it actually. Even despite my best intentions, I started preaching on that passage. But it's one of my very favorite passages. So we're going to move on to verse 43. So which is after all that. So after Samaria. So after the woman of Samaria in the well, and et cetera, et cetera. So it says, when the 2 days were over, he spends 2 days in Samaria. Not 3. But 2, not 1, not 3, but 2, right? So, and then he goes on to Galilee, right? So the 2 days that he spent with them were over, and he went from that place to Galilee. So again, it's the fulfillment is this symbolic geography. And for Jesus himself had testified that he has no honor in the prophets, or that a prophet has no honor in the prophet's own country. When he came to Galilee, so then the Galileans welcomed him. So you might say, wait a second, time out. I know from the synoptics that actually Galilee is his home country. He was from Nazareth. That was his home country. And this passage, this is just it's one of those great little nuggets. It's clearly a saying that was around in the church because the synoptics have Jesus say it. Jesus will say to the people in Nazareth, his hometown, a prophet has no honor in his hometown, right? And that's why you're rejecting me. Here, John, so clearly that's something Jesus said. Okay, now, John, though, takes that saying of Jesus and makes it an editorial comment of his own. But here, again, the symbolic geography has been turned on its head. Because what's the hometown from which Jesus is rejected here in John's gospel? It's Jerusalem. Because Jesus is God. That's the underlying thing. And God's hometown is Jerusalem, where the temple is. That's why why John has Jesus cleanse the temple at the very beginning of his narrative in chapter 1, right? Where the synoptic gospels have that all the way just before the passion. Basically, it's like this was the straw that broke the camel's back. Why? Because John wants to set up this symbolic geography that, in a sense, God came home in Jesus to the temple right away. I mean, in chapter 1 of the narrative. Or no, I'm sorry, chapter 2. So it's right after Cana of Galilee. So, but very early on, and he finds it a disgrace. And then the authorities say, by what authority are you doing these things? And he says, tear down this temple, and in 3 days I'll raise it up again. And of course, he's speaking about his body. That's the editorial comment. So Jerusalem is the place of rejection. That's Jesus' hometown, and which he withdraws from. Galilee represents the world. The world that God so loved that he sent his only son to it. Again, this is another reason why Jesus doesn't have the nativity, or John doesn't have the nativity narratives, right? Because that would confuse the symbolic geography. So John doesn't need a nativity narrative. He doesn't want Jesus in Bethlehem, outside of Jerusalem, and then up in Galilee for a little while, and then restart the story on the River Jordan. He keeps it very clean thematically, right? So again, it's just to read the Gospels from the point of view of the thematic symbolism in it. Don't try to think, don't try to square, put this square peg into a round hole. You'll never get there unless you're a conservative Baptist, and I don't even know how they make this fit. But anyway, that's not my problem. I'm not, they can handle themselves. There are clearly a lot of them, so they're doing quite well without my input. So he is rejected in Jerusalem, welcomed in Galilee. He came to Galilee, the Galileans welcomed him, and since they had seen all that he had done in Jerusalem, well, what had he done? What has he done in Jerusalem? He cleansed the temple, right? That's all that he had done. I just find that fascinating. It's not like there's a big record of miracles or something that John has reported, but it was in claiming the temple for himself and asserting his authority over it. They saw what he'd done in Jerusalem at the festival, for they too had gone to the festival. Okay, so you have the symbolic geography. So then moving on to John 4:46 to 54, right? Is the centurion at Capernaum, and you have this whole healing narrative, which we don't read on a Sunday. We don't read on a Sunday, so you would never have heard it. And is it just me? Is it really dark in this room? It's really strange. Anyway, okay. Sorry, stream of consciousness. I'll try to focus. We may have to raise those shades or something. Then he came again to Cana in Galilee, where he changed the water to wine. So it's resetting the symbolism. He goes to Gentile country, so it underlines. So it's like, you already told us, John, that he went to Gentile country. He wants to underline. No, did you hear it? He's going to Gentile country. And sure enough, who does he encounter? A Gentile, and not just any Gentile, but a Gentile par excellence, a Roman occupier. I mean, this is as good as Samaria, folks, right? So in Samaria, you have the ethnic enemy of the Jews, the ethnic other, right? It's not like the Samaritans had power. It's just they were like, it's a little bit heightened, it's probably about a tenth, to the 10th power of the Red River rivalry. I mean, it's something big with this ethnic rivalry. It may be a little more like, I've used this, I won't use the off-color phrases, but for basically the region of East Texas versus the region of Louisiana, northern Louisiana. And so it's like they're probably related to each other, but they hate each other. So it's the same thing with Jews and Samaritans. Now you have the political, economic enemy of the Jews, representing the Roman occupation. And look what Jesus is doing. He's encountering both. Both kinds of other, both kinds of enemy are given a grace by Jesus. Of course, the grace of the Samaritan woman, that ethnic grace, is that she's not only an ethnic other, but she is completely out of family, right? You're a woman, man, it's like you've had 5 husbands, the man you're with now is not your husband. Basically, it's a woman with no family. And she's welcomed into family. She's made a family. She's made a bride of Christ. Right? She's included in a family. So now you have a centurion, a royal official, who said, we call him the centurion because the synoptic gospels say he's a centurion. In John's gospel, he's simply a royal official, whose son lay ill in Capernaum. Now, geography. So unless you've been there. So Cana is up in the hill country of Galilee. It's literally up the hill. It's very close to Nazareth, right? Which is why Jesus' family would be invited from in a wedding from Nazareth to go to Cana and celebrate with those families. Again, it's probably cousins and all that good stuff. I mean, they're 2 tiny little villages up in the hill country of Galilee. Capernaum is, as we know from the synoptics, and we know from archaeology, is a thriving little kind of sea village along this lake. It's a lake village, but right along, it's a fishing village, right? That's where a royal official would be. Why? Because that's where the tax money is, right? You set up shop close to where the businesses are, right? It's like why we have the courthouse right here versus somewhere, an hour out. So, or like in Atlanta, they don't have the federal office building in Atlanta. They have it right here in downtown. It's where the money is, right? So they put where the taxes come in. So that's where the royal official is. And he heard that Jesus had come from Judea to Galilee. This is all, you just have to hear this whole episode. It's densely symbolic. The Gentile official hears about Jesus. How does he hear? Because the church is preaching him, right? He stands as this symbol. So John takes this incident, which the synoptics relate, right? Has, now in the synoptics, the centurion, the person in trouble that the centurion wants Jesus' help for is a slave. But who does John put him as? A son. Of course, a son. Yeah. Because John's all about is making a family, right? It's a son. And Jesus is the Son of the Father. So it's a son is dying. Basically, the future. The Gentiles have no future unless Jesus is going to give it to them, right? And so he hears that Jesus had come from Judea. In the Synoptic Gospels, you actually have the Jewish authorities come to Jesus and say, "You should do a favor for this guy because he's one of our people, or he loves our people and he built our synagogue for us." Here you don't have any vouching, but so the Jewish elders intercede on behalf of the centurion. And so Jesus, just to remind you how this goes down, so you can understand the differences in these parallels. So Jesus starts towards the centurion house at the request of the Jewish elders. The centurion meets him halfway and says, "Oh, don't come under the roof of my house because I'm not worthy to have you come under the roof of my house. But if you just say the word, my son will be healed. Or my slave will be healed." That's the synoptic version. John is telling it differently. Here in John, the centurion goes up the mountain, right? And instead of going up Mount Zion, which in the prophetic vision, all the nations shall stream to Zion and shall worship the Lord our God. Here, he goes up the hill and he comes to Jesus himself. Jesus is the temple, like he said in chapter 2. Right? Jesus is the temple where you encounter God. He went and begged him. Now, of course, to beg indicates a posture, right? You have to understand that the royal official gets down on his knees before the king. This is going to come up with Pontius Pilate, right? So I'm just, this is a theme that's going to come up. That Jesus is the king. The royal official kneels before the true sovereign, about whom he's heard, in order to gain a future for his son, for the next generation. He begged him to come down and heal his son, for he was at the point of death. And it says coming down from heaven is Jesus' vocation. I mean, that's what the whole narrative is about. God coming down from heaven for the healing of the nations, right? To give life to those who are dead. That's the whole point of the narrative. So densely symbolic. For he was at the point of death. Then Jesus said to him, "Unless you see signs and wonders, you will not believe." So, again, this is happening in Cana of Galilee. Now, if you remember about the preaching, and we just had Cana preached in February, I want to say, of this year, during Epiphany tide of this year. You remember the pattern where his mother says, "They're out of wine." And Jesus responds to the first ask with seemingly a refusal. "Madam, what does that have to do with you or me? Right? My hour is not yet come." Here, again, so what I'm saying is, by tagging Cana of Galilee at the very beginning of this episode, John is saying, watch out for a similar pattern in the interaction between the royal official and Jesus' mother and Jesus. So here's the pattern for when you read it. Initial request, seeming refusal, right? And the you, unless you see signs, the you here is plural. It's y'all, right? Which English doesn't have, right? So, but unfortunately in the South we do have that in English. So, unless y'all see signs and wonders, y'all will not believe. Right? It's the second person plural. The official repeated request, right? And with Mary, she says to the servants, do whatever he tells you to do. The official says, Kyrie is translated as sir, but that's the ambiguous, is kyrios, Lord. It can be, kyrios can either be Lord or sir. It's like señor in Spanish, right? Señor either means Mr., like Señor Price, or el señor, the Lord. So Spanish still has that. Greek, same thing. Kyrios, come down before my little boy dies. Then fulfillment of request. That's, part 4. Go, your son will live. Right? So that's the structure of the interaction. So unless y'all see signs and wonders, y'all will not believe. So the official says, Lord, come down to my little boy before he dies, and go, your son will live. And so that's the statement of Jesus' mission, so that those who are at the point of death may live. That's what Jesus does. He gives life to those who are at death. And so the Son is representative of humanity itself. Humanity under grace. Humanity under grace. And if you put if you have that sheet, you can mark it. If you put a little parenthesis around will live, just to make sure you understand that that's a big theme, John repeats that phrase, in a sense, the verb alive or will live, 3 times. You find it down on verse 51. As he was going down, his slaves met him and told him that his child was alive. Then skip down to 53. The father realized that this was the hour when Jesus had said to him, your son will live. Okay? So is 3 times in the Bible, in the biblical world, means it's really for sure. It's a solemn promise, going on, right? 3 times. Jesus brings life out of death. That's the gospel. That's the gospel in this passage. That's what he's trying to tell you. And the other big theme is belief. So the man, it says, Jesus told him, go, your son will live. The man believed the word that Jesus spoke to him. This is in a sense, entry-level belief. You believe the word, right? You believe the word. And then, but you go down to 53, basically he's informed that, so the father asks, he asks, so when did this happen? when did he get better? They asked the hour. Yesterday at 1 in the afternoon. It's 1 hour after he met the Samaritan woman, in other words. So he meets the Samaritan woman at 12. It's this 1 in the afternoon. Jesus is progressing on his mission. He's going to, ultimately by the end of the story, he's going to be in night, in darkness. Again, it's just another one of those subtle little thematic things that John does through this gospel, that he has Jesus, in a sense, walk through a day and into the dawn of the next day by Easter. Right? So right now it's 1 in the afternoon. Things are hot with glory, right? He's healing people, he's doing signs. But we're going to be getting to night by chapter 13. But there will be a dawn in chapter 20. So he believed. Then the father realized that this was the hour when Jesus said to him, your son will live. So he himself believed. It's like, again, didn't he already believe?
Yeah.
But now he's at a new, deeper level of belief. In a sense, what John seems to be indicating is that There's a belief that comes from a testimony of the word, and which kind of that initial belief of hearing a preaching. And then there's a deeper belief that is coming from an experience. In a sense, the Father experienced, because he has heard that actually what Jesus said has come true. That's what's happened, right? His slaves, again, linked with chapter 2, Cana of Galilee, where the slaves are ferrying the water into wine. The slaves bring the word, which is the wine, the good news. And then Jesus, then he believes that at this deeper experiential level, right? And it's almost like thematically now, it's like, the lights are behaving. And so this was the second sign that Jesus did after coming from Judea to Galilee, meaning the Cana was number 1, and then this healing is number 2. So another thing that John is going to be doing is he's going to be having a sign, it's like signs count, right? And guess how many signs there'll be by the end of the gospel, biblical number? 7 signs. So it's kind of like for John to say, for those of you paying attention, this is sign number 2. Right? We're going to be moving along, right? We're going to be moving along. So this is a good time and place to stop. And but just simply, I'm just going to check my notes really quick I think I've covered it. So then even though the man, he believes on hearing the word, but he follows Jesus' instructions and goes on his way. And in a sense, before he receives what he's asking for. And this is another Johannine model of discipleship. In a sense, you don't wait until you see the goodies that you want from God in prayer. You go and you do disciple, you do mission. You basically act as if it will be made so, and then lo and behold, guess what happens? It's made so, right? As opposed to sitting in unbelief. I'm not going to go until I see the goodies, right? That doesn't get you to the end of the story, does it? All right, so we'll be back with chapter 5 next week. All right, happy Sunday.